Israel has temporarily halted the distribution of aid in Gaza. It follows 3 days of violent scenes where civilians waiting for food were killed by Israeli gunfire. Yesterday, Palestinian officials said more than 20 people died as they attempted to collect aid at one of these centres run not by the United Nations but by a US-backed company. There have been accusations that Netanyahu's government is using starvation as a weapon of war while intentionally undermining the authority of the United Nations. Tonight, as predicted, a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza failed to pass at the Security Council after being vetoed by the states. 14 out of the 15 member states voted for the resolution, which also demanded aid access across the enclave. Joining me to discuss all of this are Fianna Fáil TD Paul McAuliffe, Social Democrat TD Jennifer Whitmore, author and activist Fintan Drury, and Owen McNeill, editor of The Ditch. You can send us your comments. Simply scan the QR code or contact us via the WhatsApp number. First, we're going to go to Leila Milana Allen, who's a special correspondent with PBS, and Laser Berman, diplomatic reporter with the Times of Israel. Leila, what's the latest in terms of this pause to the distribution of aid and how long it might last?
So essentially, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is this new organisation that's been distributing aid, has had to stop because more than 100 Palestinians have been killed in just the last 3 days while getting aid. They say that they've paused for at least 24 hours to reconsider their operations. The reason that this has been happening is that the way this is planned out, there are 4 stations in the south of Gaza where people can go and get aid. Now, this is completely different from the way that the UN runs it, which is that they would deliver aid to 400 different areas across Gaza, and it's meted out by the population register so they make sure everyone gets food. Instead, the way this is working is that everyone has to come down to the south at a certain time of the morning. There's no organisation as to who gets the aid. They just queue, so people are queuing from 2 a.m. onwards. They then have to carry around 20 kilos of aid back to their families. And remember, many people are living in the north and the centre of the Gaza Strip, and they're moving through areas where there is an ongoing military campaign. These outposts are within Israeli military areas. They are run by American military contractors. And when the Israelis have opened fire, when the IDF has opened fire over the last 3 days, on Sunday they said that they didn't open fire, they were warning shots. It's become clear that's not the case. At least 31 people were killed. The same thing has happened the last 2 days. The IDF said today that the killings yesterday happened because people veered off the exact route they were supposed to take. Now, the reality is when you've got hundreds of thousands of desperate, starving people who've all been told to come to one place with no order at a certain time to pick up food, there is no way to keep them within those restrictions. And as such, all aid organisations who've been concerned about this since it started 8 days ago are saying this is an utterly inhuman way of delivering aid, and people are being murdered by the military because they are so hungry.
But is that dysfunction by design, Leila?
Well, that's what some people suspect. So essentially what's happened is that the Israeli government has banned the UN from delivering aid, as is their want. They say that the UN is politicised. They also say that Hamas is stealing aid from the UN and that the UN is allowing them to do so. There is absolutely no evidence of that. Now, it's been 3 months since the end of the last ceasefire deal, and since then, Israel has not allowed aid into Gaza. They allowed a very small amount in 2 weeks ago after huge international pressure. Gaza needs at least 500 to 600 aid trucks a day to come in just to keep people alive. They allowed a couple of hundred in, and that was it. What they said was they wanted a new and depoliticised non-UN system, which would organise aid. But of course, it's deeply politicised because the Israeli government is running it, and it is being run by military contractors. Now, already the Boston Consulting Group, one of the American businesses involved in this, has pulled out. The head of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation pulled out just a day before it was launched because he said there was no way to make this fit humanitarian principles. It was completely politicised and militarised. So essentially, this goes against all international norms and laws because it is using aid, as many people argue, essentially as a way of controlling people in Gaza. It is choosing who has access to it, which is completely against international law. And as I say, some argue that this is being used as a way to control the movement of Gazan people, to make them follow directives as to where the IDF wants them to go. And of course, remember, people across Gaza have been displaced 5, 6, 7, 8 times over the last 19, 20 months. Many of these people are already severely injured. Many of them are already starving. They are absolutely desperate. There was an incredibly sad interview with a young boy yesterday who said that his mother and brother had been killed going to get aid, and he didn't know whether he wanted to die by a bullet or by starvation.
Laser, we're used to, in this country, seeing the kind of explanations of the IDF and of Israeli government spokespeople. What's the reaction, though, of the public at large in Israel to this latest issue, these kind of dire warnings about the humanitarian crisis?
Well, I'll say, first of all, that it's not dominating headlines. I think what's dominating headlines right now is whether this government will survive. There's motions that seem to be in process to bring the government down. But when it is reported, I think there is some sense that this is certainly not being done, at least as of now, in an ideal fashion. This needs to be done in a much more organized manner. And that's hopefully why the GHF paused operations, at least temporarily, to get this under control. But I think there is also an understanding that what has been done in the past was absolutely part of Hamas's efforts and its success in controlling not only who gets aid, but also in funding their own war against Israel. So what happened in the past, I would not say worked very well. I'm not sure that this will work, but at least it is a new idea and a way around continuing to fund Hamas's war machine against its own people and against Israel.
How real is the threat of government collapse?
I think it's getting more and more real as we go along. We've had two ultra-Orthodox parties who have heard from their not from the politicians, but from the rabbis who kind of guide them on policy, that they should start preparing bills to take apart this coalition. This is, of course, over the inability of this government to come to a compromise on drafting ultra-Orthodox young men. This is a red line for ultra-Orthodox parties. They do not want to see their community being drafted into the military.
Something we often hear here, and we've heard over the last, year and a half or so, has been that, there's lots of Israelis who kind of balk at the policies of Benjamin Netanyahu. And I just wonder, Laser, what you made of that Penn State University poll. It was published in Haaretz, is where I read it. 82% of Jewish Israelis support expelling Gazans. It would suggest that Netanyahu is maybe more ad idem with his population than we've been led to believe.
Sure, so I'll just make two broader points and then I'll address your question directly. Let's say when you have polls during war, let's say you take polls of what Ukrainians think about Russians, it's never going to be too positive. But I think what has been consistent in polling in Israel is that most of the public, first of all, doesn't trust this government. And also something like 2/3 want to see the war ended and the hostages be brought back and see that be their priority. So it doesn't seem like, the public is out in the streets calling for what this poll shows. Now, if someone calls and asks much of the public, I'm sure it's not that hard during a war to say some pretty extreme positions. But let's talk about what this might say about where the Israeli public is. I think that's why it's of interest to you. And I think it doesn't show any certainty about the way forward, as some might think, but I think it shows this utter confusion amongst the Israeli public and a frustration, which didn't start on October 7th. I think the way most of the Israeli public would see, what has been done to them and where things stand with the Palestinians is that, hey, we tried to reorient our policies and our politics around peace processes with the Palestinians in the 90s. That blew up in our faces in the 2000s. Then we tried unilateral withdrawals from Lebanon, from the Gaza Strip, and we were planning even, and we voted for withdrawal from the West Bank under Ehud Olmert. And that obviously led to severe violence and the buildup of these armies like Hezbollah and Hamas. And it seems like with the re-election of Benjamin Netanyahu in 2009, he wasn't elected as this right-winger. He was elected as someone who's just going to not try any more new experiments around, drastic moves toward peace or toward rearranging relations with the Palestinians. And that basically worked until October 7th. So I think if you're asking the Israeli public, they would say that they're confused, they're frustrated. They might be wrong about that. You might not agree with them. But I think given that they have tried to rearrange politics over different types of solutions here, at least they have some right to feel the way they do. And I think when you get answers like that, it's basically throwing up their hands. They're saying, we don't have an answer for how we can move to a more positive future with the Gazans at least. We've tried things, we've left, and this is what we got. We got October 7th in return. So I think it's more of an expression of deep frustration and a lack of any answers and not any plan to actually carry it out. Though I will note there are certainly on the far right end of the political spectrum, even in this coalition, you have Itamar Ben-Gvir, who would probably would like to see this happen.
Laser and Leila, thank you both very much for joining us. Fintan, I know you've been writing about the history of all of this and where it has led us with catastrophe and Nakba to this book that you've published. So in that context, and given your understanding and what we've been talking about there in terms of the policies of the Netanyahu government and also public opinion in Israel. So 82%, as they say in that poll, of Jewish Israelis supporting the forced removal of Gazans. Not quite the same majority, but still a majority. I think 54% were supportive of the idea of all Arabs in Israel being deported out of the country and dumped somewhere else. To what extent is that a consequence of what we've seen over the last 18 months? Or to what extent is it a consequence of something much more deep-rooted? Is it years in the making, those attitudes?
It's decades, generations in the making, and it's been fomented by a West that has been utterly supportive of Israel, as Israel is manifest now in the Netanyahu government, but all previous Israeli governments. And, to hear a journalist based in Israel talk about the current issue around the deliberate starvation of the population of Gaza that has already suffered 20 months of bombardment as, less than ideal. Actually, there is no need to explore further the mindset within institutional Israel than to think that this journalist is telling us that he acknowledges somehow, and we should think it is wonderful that he's acknowledging that the approach being taken to save 2 million people from starving is less than ideal, and we should explore other options. That, in a sense, encapsulates, for me, the whole mantra around Israel. I haven't trusted Israel since I was a young journalist in the 1980s, and I covered the area significantly, albeit mainly from a studio in Dublin, but interviewing people who were experts. I travelled to the Middle East. I worked in Libya. I felt at that time that in terms of the Israel-Palestine issue, Israel was not to be trusted. We now know definitively Israel is not to be trusted. We knew back in 1917, when the Balfour Declaration was agreed in Britain, the one dissenting voice at the cabinet that signed off on it was a Jew, the only Jewish member of the British cabinet who said, do not do this. Do not give the land of Palestine to the Zionists, because you're going to store up huge issues, not just for the Palestinian people whose land it is, also for the Jewish people.
Yeah. Can I ask then, in that context, the preoccupation here is with the occupied territories. Is that missing the point? If that's the prevailing mindset in Israel, should we be talking about our trade with the entire state rather than just goods and services from two particular parts of that state?
Well, unquestionably, but also to go back to the narrative that you've just been presented with from Israel tonight. And, a situation where the IDF's behaviour is recognised as being destructive of the welfare of people, not just in Gaza, but also in the occupied territories, where they are helping people that we are told to consider as settlers. They are thieves. They are stealing land that is not theirs, and they are being facilitated. But we here, in terms of the economics of this, in terms of the Occupied Territories Bill, we're focused on the trade that we do with the occupied territories. To your question, Kieran, it's not enough. We need to look at the amount of trade that we are doing with the State of Israel.
Owen, can you give us a sense of how much trade we are doing with the State of Israel?
There were figures published recently. Ireland was listed as Israel's second largest trading partner. It was up around 4 billion. That's the entire state of Israel. Much of that figure was accounted for goods that were being imported to Ireland and being used by US companies. We've also reported on Ireland's trade with the occupied territories, with the bill. With the ditch, oftentimes when we talk about the Occupied Territories Bill, there can be this assumption that the trade with occupied territories from Ireland is, not all that significant. What we reported this week with the ditch is that, according to figures that we obtained from the Israel Tax Authority themselves, they actually book exports from Ireland to the occupied territories, but as being about 40 times higher than what the CSO accounts for.
So a huge amount of trade with not just the occupied territories, but with the entire state of Israel. What would the bill that your government is currently preparing, Paul, do about that?
Well, and it is an important distinction between the occupied territories and trade with the state of Israel. But I have to say that I think a lot of viewers will be very frustrated with Laser's assessment there that Israel is struggling to find an answer. What is not the answer is what's happening in Gaza at the moment. I think the Taoiseach is right in calling it out as genocide, and I think Ireland has been incredibly strong with other like-minded countries, with Arab states, to call out what is happening, and there's been action with that as well. So the Occupied Territories Bill, it's important, but it's a small component, I think, of the trade argument. I think a bigger component is what we are doing with other European Union countries on the EU-Israel trade deal. So you will have noticed that we were lone voices on that many months ago, and we now have a majority of EU countries that have called for a review of that agreement. And the Taoiseach has said that actually that agreement should be suspended entirely pending the outcome of that review, and that would have a far more significant impact on trade.
So a majority have called for a review. How many do a majority agree with the Taoiseach that it should be suspended pending the outcome of the review?
I think not enough, Kieran, is the problem. And look, for lots of historical reasons, Europe has very different views on this. I think Ireland, Spain, Belgium, Iceland are very much in agreement, but there are countries that are not. And as I say, there are historical reasons for that. I don't believe they're correct. I believe that
would you agree we've done nothing of consequence?
Not at all. Not at all. I'm not sure how you could suggest that.
What have we done that has had any consequence for Benjamin Netanyahu's government? Well, negative impact?
Let's just take, for example, UNRWA. Like when Israel was attempting to dismantle the funding of UNRWA, Ireland was one of the first countries to step in, not only to reject the accusations that they were somehow complicit in October 7th, but also to directly fund them, to directly fund their core funding. We've provided more than €75 million worth of funding to Palestinian aid. That's a really significant and concrete action that we've taken, but we've taken many others as well. At the ICJ, Sir Rossa Fanning has argued the Irish case in regards to that. And as I say, look, diplomacy is a difficult thing to explain in black and white terms, but we have moved the dial in Europe, and we've been part of the people who have done that. Unfortunately, on trade and on the regulation of bonds, these are areas that we pool our sovereignty with other European countries. That protects us in trade negotiations and so on, but it frustrates us when we have when we want to take unilateral action.
Jennifer, would you like to have seen us done more?
Absolutely, and I think it's really important that we do more. I think Ireland has. When it was needed, we were talking really strong language, and I agree there was the condemnation from Ireland. I think it was important when it happened. However, we have not followed up with the actions that we need to see. It is going on far too long. I welcome the fact that the Taoiseach has referred to it directly as a genocide, but I think once he stated that, I think there is a huge responsibility on him now and us as a state to do as much as we possibly can to prevent the genocide any further. And so, therefore,
what does that look like in practical terms?
Well, there's things like the Occupied Territories Bill. I know it's not perfect, and it does, just deal with the Occupied Territories, but it is important. And considering this has been in play since 2018, I think it is one of those things that should be pretty much ready to go, and hopefully. What I said actually is that the Dáil should sit over the summer to make sure that gets through the legislative programme as quickly as possible. I think that's important. There's the bonds from the central bank. The central bank should not be facilitating bonds for Israel. They're essentially enabling the funding of this genocide. They're funding the bullets they're shooting children in the head. No, they absolutely are. Israel have been very clear where their money the money they're making from those bonds is going.
Did you look at the central bank statement on the matter?
The central bank has a responsibility to sign off on that, and there's a whole lot of key issues that they need to sign off on.
We might differ on this. The central bank issued a statement. They very clearly state that they are governed by EU regulations in this matter. They don't have a legal mechanism to deprive them of the.
Have you looked at the EU regulations?
I have, yeah. But I certainly the central bank shared much of what we've discussed here and their view on it, and they say that they're appalled what's happening. The central bank are not making this decision to somehow fund Israel. Why would they do that? They're doing it because there's legal limits. There's legal limits in what they can do.
They absolutely have a responsibility. When they're signing off on that, there are conditions that they need to be signing off on.
And they're fiscal and regulatory. They are not related to. They're not related to other
issues of risk in relation to those bonds.
So Jennifer, let's say last week we'd voted with you, okay? And we on very shaky legal grounds, right?
No, it wasn't shaky legal grounds. Absolutely not. No.
And in breach of
the OPLA itself said that bill was within the legal
and in breach of EU regulations. As sure as night follows day, we will be handing Israel a moral victory when that bill was struck down.
Oh, listen, there's no way you could handle Israel a moral victory. They're conducting a genocide.
Yeah, of course they're conducting a genocide.
And
We've already said that.
There is a responsibility.
So why would we give them an opportunity?
Just let me talk for a second.
Why would we give them an opportunity?
There is a responsibility on us as a state to do absolutely everything we can to ensure that to stop the genocide if we can, and we are not doing it. We are not. Standing up in the Dáil and saying words is not going to stop the genocide. We need sanctions. There hasn't actually been any sanctions on Israel. This has been happening now for 20 months, and we have stood by, and the rest of the world has stood by while this has gone on.
You do know we're in the European Union, where trade is a pool.
Yeah, listen, Paul, listen, the legal advice wasn't quite as black and white as you suggest it is. It did acknowledge that, yes, there is a kind of a European framework to all of this, but there are exceptions that can be made in certain circumstances. Now, whether this would meet those certain circumstances exception, we do not know, but the government weren't willing to test it.
No, but the government can't test things willy-nilly. The government has to be guided by legal advice. OK, and if something is, if it's recommended that it's not legal, the government cannot proceed. And I'd say for us to proceed on that basis, we would essentially be handing, if the bill was struck down, we'd be handing Israel a moral victory. I don't want to do that. I want to concentrate on actual sanctions, which would happen at a European level.
Fintan.
Yeah, I might want to come back. It's interesting to hear the opposition and the government having a row, but I don't think people care anymore. I think what they want is to hear a united voice in the Dáil about the things that matter to them, and that's shown by the recent poll in the Sunday Independent last weekend. It's shown by the millions that go out marching around this country almost every week. I mean, you asked a question earlier on of one of the contributors about, whether or not this starvation, this encroaching famine, is engineered in some way. I mean, with respect, Kieran, that's not open to question anymore. This is part of what they have set about. They are attempting to remove the Palestinians, and they will kill them with bombs and bullets, and those that survive, they will give them an opportunity, potentially, to leave. But if they don't leave or can't leave, they are prepared to starve them to death. Now, if you look at the facts around this, they bombarded them for 20 months. They knew they were, because of the long-standing blockade, they were penned in. They can't get out, right? And what had they been doing for the last 20 years? They've been destroying the agriculture in Gaza. Forensic Architecture, an agency in England, has been tracking this for over 10 years. And they have satellite imagery that shows the extent to which they have been shrinking the available agrarian land for Gazans to be able to feed themselves. Yeah. So they destroy the capacity for them to feed themselves. Yeah. And then, at this point, they can't feed themselves anymore. They've had 20 months of a bombardment, and they're now stopping the aid getting to them.
But let me ask you this. How confident are you that we will get what you want and what you say people at home want, which is a unified voice calling for action, given how long Francis Black and others have been campaigning on the Occupied Territories bill? And the best we've gotten, with all due respect, Paul, is a watered-down version of it, where services aren't even included.
Correct. I'm not confident at all. I mean, I've been around politics for long enough to know and understand the drill. But on something this important, I don't think we have faced a moral issue around politics. And by the way, don't let the business community off here either, because we haven't heard people from IBEC speaking out about what needs to happen and what needs to change, and the fact that companies that are part of the IBEC system are going to make sacrifices. I mean, there is no moral leadership coming. And I'm tired of people, with respect to the two politicians on my right-hand side, saying, oh, we called it out as a genocide. They did belatedly. They were far too slow to call it out as genocide when everyone knew that's what was happening.
Oh, and is it that interrelationship between the business community, between foreign direct investment, those big multinationals, between the Irish state, and how much we rely on that relationship? Do you suspect that is part of the reason that we haven't taken concrete action?
Sure. I mean, last year we reported about the former US ambassador to Ireland, Claire Cronin, one of the Biden administration, supposedly one of the good guys, who emailed government leaders talking about her concerns about the Occupied Territories Bill. And you read, it was a very politely and civilly written email, but it was full of effective threats, and it was saying that she didn't want to see any unforeseen consequences for Ireland were we to enact this Occupied Territories Bill. And she referred to the 1,000 or so American companies who didn't want to be facing economic uncertainty. Now, after she sent that email, Micheál Martin announced, oh, look, we're just going to go and review this, Similarly, I mean, the Financial Times over the last week has been saying that, look, the exclusion of services from this version of the Occupied Territories Bill, it's there to protect US multinationals and companies who are here. It's really quite blatant. And it's interesting, we can invoke Rossa Fanning when it suits. I mean, we published his advice to government in full. People can go read it. He was all good with services, basically. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. But, there is no good legal reason for that. And it's incredibly crass to hear this, to hear government figures saying that they're doing everything that they can. I mean, I was down in Ennis District Court speaking to activists who've been forced into direct action to inspect US warplanes, something that government won't do. The state is now prosecuting them. Now, none of those people are there going, aren't we great? We're putting our bodies on the line here. But government figures will do that. And it's crass, it's tiring, it's awful.
Paul, you wanted to come back in on the services side of the Occupied Territories Bill.
Just 2 points that Owen says. Look, actually, on services, I would have read Rossa Fanning's comments. Taoiseach said clearly, on policy terms, he has no issue with services being included in it. It's about finding a legal mechanism and using the committee time to try and tease that out to see if we can include it. That's the first thing. The second thing is, look, I hear when people say it's crass that politicians are saying that they're the best boys in the class and so on and that. It's difficult to be accused of doing nothing and taking no action. Then you cite the actions and then you're somehow criticised for trying to take credit for your actions. So that's a catch-22 for us. Look, a far more important conversation.
Not to put words in Owen's mouth, but I think the criticism is a lack of concrete action. Now, what he's talking about are people actually putting their bodies on the line. Now, nobody's suggesting that you and members of the Dáil put your bodies on the line, but really what you're congratulating yourselves for are releasing statements. Sorry, Paul, that's it.
I disagree.
You're releasing statements.
I disagree. And as I say, the diplomatic work which the Irish government has undertaken, the direct funding of things like UNRWA. Micheál Martin is one of the few foreign leaders that has sat in front of the Israeli foreign minister and has told them what they're doing is self-defeating and will not provide. He looked him in the eye and he said it to him directly. So, look, I think what the conversation...
What impact did it have?
I think, sure, the entire world is rejecting Israel, what it's doing, and it seems fruitless and frustrating. I think the bigger conversation is what are we doing as a continent of Europe?
The entire world is not rejecting Israel and what it's doing. That's a nonsense.
The bigger conversation is that we should have more allies on this issue and we don't.
No, but I mean, to make a statement as broad as that, when we know that there are countries still supporting Israel by providing them with arms, many countries within the European Union, you've cited the European Union a number of times, as if we should be, happy that the European Union is representing our interests as a sovereign state. The European Union has disgraced itself.
Agreed.
The President of the EU Commission has disgraced herself and the institution of the European Union.
I don't disagree with that. When I say the entire world, if you look at the United Nations, there's a huge majority of countries that are rejecting what Israel are doing. Unfortunately, there are a small number of Western countries that are not. And many of them, for historical reasons, are in the European Union. I
don't agree that there are many countries in UN countries in the West who are, no longer supporting Israel. They are continuing to provide them with arms.
Yes, that's true. Yes.
So how could they not be supporting?
But I think that's what I think you're correct. The domestic conversation we have, where we're splitting hairs about how the level of support we're giving to the Palestinian cause, the bigger conversation is, why is there not a bigger consensus at an international level? In particularly, as someone who's very strong in Europe, a very proud European, I am really disappointed, incredibly disappointed. I agree with you. It is shameful how the EU has acted on this issue. There should be greater unity.
But we're giving ourselves a cop-out there, aren't we? By saying we've got to pursue this kind of on European terms and with kind of European unity at the core of it, and yet at the same time the European leadership is absolutely failing us. Why don't we show a bit of leadership? Why don't we enact the Occupied Territories Bill that Francis backdrafted? Why don't we prevent the sale of Israeli war bonds? And why don't we stop planes landing in Shannon and taking off again with munitions to blow kids to bits in Israel?
You know the answer to that, and the answer is because our legal constitutional framework is intertwined with the European Union. There are things we can do. There are things we can do, and there are things we can't. Like you know that, Kieran. You know on trade. You know on trade.
That is not true. The reason we're not doing it is because we're afraid. Yeah. We're afraid of the consequences. We're afraid of the consequences of being a real outlier in the Western world when a genocide is happening.
And you know what else is actually afraid of the consequences as well? We've reported on hacked emails from the Israeli Department of Justice. It's very easy for us to say, oh, we're just this small island nation and all that kind of crack. In these internal mails, senior officials in the Israeli Department of Justice were very worried about the Occupied Territories Bill because they were worried about what they saw as potential
policy
contagion.
But they haven't impacted
and we could have been the first to go and do that. It's been 6 years as well.
Yeah, but they haven't impacted on Irish policy.
Jennifer, do you think it's a fear of consequences?
Oh, I absolutely do. I think when you look at, say, the issues around trade and the fact that we're like the second largest trading partner of Israel, and a lot of the multinationals would have that trade relationship with Israel. I think, there's certainly questions that we need to be having about what level of influence that is having on our ability to make decisions in relation to what's happening. I think it's really clear. And look at, I think the Occupied Territories Bill, it is good. It's good that we will be hopefully passing it shortly, but it is a very small component. Just in relation to what Paul is saying, because I think it is thrown out a lot that, the trade is an EU competency and everything else. The planes that are going through our airspace, that are stopping in our airports, they are absolutely, so setting aside that EU responsibility or collaboration, that those planes are completely within our legislative framework and our responsibility. So why isn't the government doing anything on that? The Ditch has repeatedly provided all the information that's required. I think it was even handed over to the Taoiseach Tánaiste in the Dáil at one stage. So that absolutely could be done, but instead the government is taking this sort of hear no evil, see no evil approach. They're reviewing it. This, I think was finalised in March. Still nothing from it. So why aren't we moving on that simple thing?
And Paul might know his party colleagues who gave off-record quotes to the Irish Times when Conor Gallagher was reporting on these illegal flights. Your party colleagues gave off-record quotes where they told Conor Gallagher, we're not going to do anything about these flights because we're worried about the Americans. And it's there in the Irish Times. I'm sure that was before Micheál Martin called it a genocide.
Fianna Fáil TDs on the record in the Dáil that introduced the Occupied Territories Bill.
They speak more candidly off record to Conor Gallagher. But it's up there in black and white in the Irish Times.
If we were somehow beholden to US interests, why would we be calling
for... Why do your party colleagues say this to Conor Gallagher?
Answer the question. If we were beholden to business somehow or afraid to act, why are we calling for the suspension of the EU-Israel trade deal?
That's one thing that you are doing.
It's
and
a fairly substantial thing.
Because it has the comfort of everybody else doing it as well. It's a joint thing.
Actually, that's not true, Jennifer. We were one of the first people calling.
Fintan, final word.
I can't believe that an experienced political figure is telling the audience tonight that Ireland is not beholden to the United States. I mean, not just on Israel. We're in the pocket of the United States of America. And part of that is understandable. And in fact, one of the issues that we need to have discussion about is, let's say the economics of this can't be resolved in the way in which someone like me or Jennifer or Owen might wish them to be resolved. This is a mature liberal democracy. Let the people who know why it can't be resolved in the way in which I might wish it to be resolved come forward and say, look, there's a lot of argument in favour of really cutting the backside out of the levels of trade we're doing with Israel. But we can't for the following. Here are the economic knock-on effects. Let's have a mature discussion about it. I mean, I would take the position that we need to, hold the view that we need to take a very strong moral position on it. But I'm a reasonable, rational person. We at least can have these discussions, whereas in Israel, which is not a democracy, is an ethnocracy, people cannot have those kind of discussions. And, we are fortunate in that respect. But why don't the political class, with respect, take us as the general public more seriously and invest time in explaining to us why certain things we might wish for can't happen?